Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today, and we're looking forward to spending the next 2 hours with you to talk about getting started with sustainability, our introductory course for SMEs and beginners. We'll be starting shortly with this interactive workshop. And today is designed to be practical and relevant, whether you're new to this topic or already exploring it. The goal is really simple. By the end, you should feel confident about why sustainability matters for your business and what your first steps could look like. So, before we dive in, I want to thank our partners for helping make this workshop possible, particularly the IFC and the Government of Switzerland for providing financial support for this project. Also, a very big thank you to the Ethical Supply Chain Program for joining us today to provide practical insights from their experience working with SMEs on the topic. And of course, we would not be here today if it were not for our host. So thank you so much to the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange and the full team who has made this possible. And we have with us today Joy and Natasha from the Stock Exchange. Thank you both of you for being with us. If anyone has questions for the exchange, we're so happy to have them here hosting us today. Now, we also are very lucky to have had opening remarks from the CEO of the stock exchange. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be with us today, but she sent her introductory welcome remarks, and I'm just going to play those for you now.
Good morning, colleagues at the United Nations Sustainable Exchange Initiative, presenters, and attendees. On behalf of the Trinidad Tobago Stock Exchange Limited, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to our second joint webinar with the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, Sustainability for SMEs and Beginners. I must convey our sincere appreciation to the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative for partnering with us on this important program, and to the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for their invaluable contribution to the development and delivery of this training. To our attendees from Trinidad and Tobago, our wider Caribbean, and other jurisdictions, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this session. Your presence here today signals something very important, that across boards, management teams, regulators, market intermediaries, and institutions, there is a growing recognition of the central role of sustainability in the long-term growth of small and medium enterprises. At the TTSC, our decision to co-host this training is part of our strategic plan to develop our financial infrastructure to be resilient, flexible, and sustainable. As an exchange, our role goes far beyond providing a platform for trading securities. We have a responsibility to support the development of a fair, transparent, and forward-looking capital market, one that allocates capital efficiently, manages risk appropriately, and supports sustainable economic growth. We recognize that small and medium enterprises are critical to the development of our nation. At present, SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago represent roughly 95% of the registered businesses in the country, employing nearly 35% of persons in the workforce. SMEs span various sectors, including manufacturing, retail, agriculture, technology, renewable energy, and creative industries, and are the cornerstone of sustainable development. Access to equity financing via our SME market provides tangible support to SMEs via special listing rules and supportive tax incentives, including 5 years of full tax relief, followed by 5 years of a 50% tax relief. To enable SMEs to improve their chances of success in this decade of unprecedented change, they need to be future ready. Future readiness is defined by the World Economic Forum as a set of organizational capabilities and orientations that enable companies to successfully respond to shocks and seize opportunities that emerge from constant disruption. The World Economic Forum has identified three core characteristics of future-ready SMEs: the ability to generate sustained growth, the ability to have a positive social and environmental impact, and the ability to remain resilient and agile in times of volatility. The session is designed for SMEs, business owners, executives, and professionals seeking practical tools, real-world insights, and actionable guidance on sustainability integration. It aims to assist small and medium-sized enterprises and those new to sustainability to take the first concrete steps towards managing and reporting on sustainability-related topics. This session goes to the essence of becoming future ready. This training is one of the initiatives in 2026 to raise the bar in our capital market on sustainability, making 2026 a landmark for the TTSE's path in establishing a sustainable financial infrastructure. In January 2026, we co-hosted a successful webinar with the UNSSE on gender equality and sustainability, and by the fourth quarter of 2026, with the assistance of IDB Invest, our exchange will launch its first green bond framework for sustainable financing instruments. These are very exciting initiatives which highlight how sustainable financing and practices are essential for the survival and future success of small island states like Trinidad and Tobago and our Caribbean neighbors. I encourage all participants to engage actively over the session, to ask questions, share perspectives, and think critically about how the insights from this program can be applied with your own organizations and spheres of influence. Once again, thank you to the UNSSE and all partner organizations for making this program possible, and thank you for being part of this important conversation. I wish you a productive and insightful training, and I look forward to the discussions ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Ava Mitchell, the CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange, for providing those opening comments and inspiring all of us to get started. So we're going to dive straight in now, and hopefully you can take the advice of the CEO on how to really integrate this into your work. For our training today, just a few housekeeping points. So please use the Q&A box for all of your questions. We'll answer them throughout the training. If you put those questions in the chat box, we might lose them because, as you can see, there's many comments coming throughout the chat. But we will use the chat to put all the links that we're talking about of resources in there. If you miss them, don't worry. They're also in the slide handout that you can find on our website. So today we are together for 2 hours. There is a 5-minute break, a little bit past the halfway mark. We also have live Q&A throughout. We'll have the chat box for any comments you might have, and we'll be doing activities together. Just to note, for that activity side of it, we do expect your participation. So please be an active participant in this training program today. That's how you'll get the most out of it. We'll be using various different tools, such as something called Mentimeter, which is something we'll share a link to in the chat when we get to our first question, and it'll help you to engage with us and share your thoughts. But we'll also be using polls in Zoom itself, and these just pop up automatically on your screen. Now, to reward you for that participation, we will give you a certificate. This course is CPD certified. We just require you to do a quick feedback survey and quiz, and we will share that information at the very end of the workshop today. So, as a brief introduction to who will be facilitating this workshop today, my name is Tiffany Grabsky. I am the SSE Academy head, and I am so pleased to be joined today with our SSE training officer, Fiona Quinlan Wells. Thanks, Fiona, for being here with us today. We are also very pleased to be joined with Tim Ziegler, who's manager of social impact programs at the Ethical Supply Chain Program. And as I mentioned at the start, we're very pleased to have ESCP with us today to share their real life experience with you. And we have a few goals to achieve today. And so by the end of this workshop, we hope you are able to understand why sustainability matters to your business, be able to see how it connects to your strategy and your long-term objectives. Also, be able to identify those practical first steps that you can use to integrate sustainability into your business practices. And finally, to understand who you may need to communicate with and how to go about that. Most importantly, this workshop is not about achieving perfection. It's really about understanding enough to get started and then to build your practices over time. So, to achieve these goals, we'll start by taking you through the action areas and the checklist that you can find in our recent SSE model guidance for SMEs to integrate sustainable business practices. So, this guidance is designed to be practical and flexible so you can apply it regardless of your size or resources. The premise of this guidance is that you don't need to do everything at once. The idea is to take proportionate steps based on your capacity. You can find this guidance and the checklist that we will refer to today in our workshop on our publication page, and we'll also be sharing that link of this publication throughout the workshop in the chat, as you can already see it there now. Now, this model guidance has 4 chapters in it, which we'll work through in our training today. They are prepare, align, implement, and communicate. So in module 1, prepare, we'll start with the why this matters to your business in particular, even if you're a very small business. Then we will drive into the how with a focus on strategy and governance. Next, we'll look at practically what can be done. And finally, we'll discuss communication, where and with who to share information about your sustainability journey. We'll include interactive elements and a short 5-minute break around I'd say just past the halfway mark. Great. So now it's time that we hear from all of you, and we're going to go to the Mentimeter that I was discussing to do that. So I'm going to just share my screen here so you can see the results of the Mentimeter. Great. So you should be able to now see that Mentimeter. And you can use that QR code to join, or you can use the link in the chat. And we're going to be using Mentimeter to do a few different activities together today. So we suggest opening this either on your mobile device or in a browser on your computer and keeping that open throughout the duration of this workshop so that we can come back to it later. And to get used to using Mentimeter, we're going to go through a few questions together. So the first one is to get to know a little bit about you and where you're coming from. So approximately how many employees does your company have? Now I can see that we have about 46 people in the Mentimeter, and we have nearly 100 people in the webinar with us today. So if you're having any trouble accessing the Mentimeter, please just let us know in the chat and we'll help you out to make sure that you can participate in all of our activities today. Great. So I'm seeing the numbers start to come in here. It looks like the majority of participants are indeed very small organizations from 0 to 10 employees. But we have it going up to seven of you are coming from organizations with up to 10,000 employees. So that's really great to see that you're able to use the Mentimeter, and we get a sense now of the size of the companies that are here. I'm going to give you 3 more seconds to fill that in, and then I'm going to move to the next question. 3, 2, 1. Last chance. Okay, great. So that actually evened out. We have now equal amounts of 0 to 10 employees and 10 to 250. So good to see that we get, oh, someone just topped that over the edge. Great. So now we want to know, how comfortable are you on this topic? Do you feel ready to integrate sustainability into your business practices? Anywhere from not ready at all to very ready. There's no wrong answer here. We just want to get a sense of where you're at. What is your comfort level with this particular topic? And I'm going to give you a moment to fill that in. It looks like some of you feel very ready, and that's really great to see. So I hope you participate in our activities together. We really want to see what you think about these different areas we're going to look at today. Maybe you can test your knowledge a little bit there too, but you can also help to educate the rest of the participants in this workshop. Some of you do not feel ready at all, and that's totally okay. We hope by the end of this workshop, you're feeling much more confident on the topics, but also understanding what are the areas you can work on. I'm going to give you 3 more seconds. I see a few more of you are in the Menti, but you haven't filled it in. So 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. And we landed on the 6 out of 10. So a good comfort level, I would say there. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go back to the slides, and I'm going to pass to my colleague Fiona, who's going to kick us off on our first module. Over to you, Fiona.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany. And hi, everyone. Great to be here with you all today. So, as Tiffany says, we'll get started now on the first content module of our training, which is prepare. So, here we're really starting out with understanding what's driving sustainability, particularly for smaller companies and how they can approach this topic. So here we're going to focus in particular on 3 key areas. So we're going to start off with the big picture. So what's happening and why does sustainability matter? We're then going to drill in a little bit more to your specific business context and start to think about the so what's in that regard. And then finally, we'll think about your capacity to respond, because of course we know that sustainability really looks different for every business. So a lot of this is going to be about understanding things in your own context and figuring out how to act on that basis. So before we get started, we know it can be important to align firstly on what we mean by sustainability to get us on the right footing for today's workshop. So let's start firstly with the definition for sustainability and what we mean by this. So one of the most commonly referenced sort of foundational definitions for sustainability that's used in this space comes from a report called the Brundtland Commission, which was released in 1987 by the UN. And this defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, this statement we know can feel quite ambitious, and it may even be something that feels a little out of reach for those just getting started on sustainability or on smaller organizations. We know that really this is, of course, an aspirational goal, so sometimes it can also be helpful to formulate it into a more practical way and think about how it can apply directly to SMEs or really to any business. So, let's think a little bit further about that now. So, for any business, really, sustainability means running your business in a way that meets the needs both of that business and of the clients today, but allowing it to keep functioning long into the future. So, this often means also supporting communities and the environment so that the overall ecosystem that you operate in, which of course supports your business, can continue to thrive over the long term. And so, when we're talking about sustainability today for business, what we really mean is businesses that pursue long-term business success through responsible management practices. So, that involves managing responsibly the environmental and social impacts, risks, and opportunities that the business faces. It also means implementing sound governance practices to really ensure that the value of your company remains viable, competitive, and relevant over time. And so the focus, especially for smaller companies, should really be on whether your business's future needs can be met. Do you depend perhaps on particular resources that are scarce that might mean that your business's success is at risk in the future when this resource potentially could be difficult to get? And also, if there's a high risk of maybe social upset that could affect your operating environment, that's something you should think about here. And does your strategy depend on a particular regulatory framework that is about to change? And these are all the big important questions that you'll need to answer in order to really consider whether your business is sustainable. So, with that in mind, let's look now at why sustainability matters for your business. So, starting, as I've said, with the big picture. So let's think first about global shifts. We see policy, science, technology, and customer expectations all really moving in that same direction towards greater accountability for environmental and social impact. And these shifts are then triggering a reaction from investors, from insurers, and regulators who are starting to demand more. They want better data, they want more transparency, and really proof that businesses are understanding and managing their risks. And because large corporations are usually the ones who are likely to be feeling that pressure first, they are really changing their public reporting practices. And so, as a result, also what information and assurance they expect from organizations in their value chain is starting to change as well. So even if perhaps you're not listed on a stock exchange, even if you perhaps don't have an investor relations team, if you supply to or work with a large business, their sustainability requirements are really becoming your sustainability requirements because that demand then gets extended throughout the supply chain. And this is really that clockwise cycle we're seeing here on that slide, where all of these trends from the big picture perspective are feeding down to what's starting to come through to smaller organizations. But in addition to the pressure that builds through this process we're seeing in the circle, we know that many SMEs, of course, are already taking action themselves in response to these global shifts. We're seeing a growing number of businesses who are voluntarily pursuing certifications and standards. So, for example, we're seeing both large and small companies utilize labels such as B Corp for brand identity and customer loyalty. We've also got the Fair Trade Initiative for consumer trust and price premium services. There are also services like Ethical Supply Chain Program, which we're going to hear a bit more today, or EcoVadis, which are opening doors in B2B supply chains. And finally, we also have certifications like the ISO 14001 certification for environmental management, which really adds credibility and helps an organization to manage its risks. And so all of that tells us something important. Those same forces that are creating pressures are also creating real opportunities. There are new markets opening up that will reward responsible suppliers. We also see public procurement that prioritizes sustainability credentials. And of course, there are clients who are actively looking for partners who can demonstrate they're ahead of this curve. And so the important thing to remember is that this big picture isn't just a risk landscape, because for businesses that move early, it can also really be a competitive advantage as well. Great, so let's look now at a few pieces of evidence which are really sort of helping us to document and show that this shift is happening. So the first resource I want to come to here is about policy and regulation. So you can take a look here at this map, which comes from the Carrots and Sticks report, assessing sustainability-related policies around the world. So for those who might not be familiar with the term ESG that's used here, this refers to environment, social, and governance, which is often used in the finance world when we're referring to the financial products or investments with a sustainability-related focus. And almost every country in the world now has at least some form of ESG or sustainability policy in place. And so the darker colours on that map show the more policies that exist in these jurisdictions. So if we're looking at Europe, North America, large parts of Asia and Latin America, which are shown in that deep blue here, we're talking upwards of 30 or more policies in place in a single country that cover sustainability-related topics. And zoning in specifically on Trinidad and Tobago, the database here also includes the Corporate Governance Code from 2013, which was issued by the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and of course the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange as well. So that code, of course, in your market, particularly relevant for driving progress and kind of emphasis here. So let's have a look at a specific example of a policy change we're seeing recently gathering pace at the global scale. So as you may know or have heard about, the IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, is a body that produces financial reporting standards which are used today in over 140 different countries around the world. So in recent years, we've seen the IFRS has set up a new standards board called the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. And the ISSB is setting new standards specifically pertaining to sustainability. Under these standards, which are referred to as IFRS S1 and S2, companies are being asked to collect data on sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So this includes, for examples, emissions from their value chain, and also would include their upstream suppliers. And if we look at this slide, we can see that already around 40 countries or jurisdictions are either using or are planning to use those ISSB standards in their own regulatory frameworks. And importantly, these jurisdictions, those 40 jurisdictions, represent a very large share of the global economy. For example, as you see here, 60% of global GDP, 40% of global market cap, and of course, 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions as well. So really, I hope this all shows that this isn't a niche trend. This is really becoming a core part of how business is done globally. So you may still be thinking, well, if my company isn't listed, how does this apply to me? And of course, you may, of course, not be directly required to report under these standards either yet or perhaps even ever. But really, the key point here is that even if that's the case, your customers, your investors, and your partners may well be. And of course, when those larger companies are going to be required to report, they're going to need information from their value chain, including the SMEs that sit within it. So, as investors, insurance and regulatory shifts are increasing a demand for sustainability related information about companies, we're also seeing formal structures being put in place to organize and standardize data. So, this not only has an effect on how companies disclose information, which we'll dive into a bit deeper later when we go into our communications module, but it can also shape what actions companies are taking and the different sustainability related focuses that they prioritize. So let's start with the disclosure standards, which you see in that lighter green box on the left-hand side. So there are several major frameworks and standards that kind of really require companies to make information public. You may not need to know them in detail, but it's helpful to understand potentially why the requests might be coming to you from suppliers for information, and also which standards you can look to for resources and guidance as well in how to structure your information here. So we already talked about that particular focus on the IFRS standards already in the last slide, so I won't repeat that again. But just to say that these aren't the only sustainability related disclosure standards that are out there. You might also have heard of the GRI or Global Reporting Initiative standards. And the approach used by these standards require an assessment of the supply chain to really assess what impact the company's activities have on society, the economy, and the environment. And there are specific GRI standards which require companies to disclose information about their procurement practices, and overall how the company performs on environmental and social assessments of its suppliers, which of course can be particularly relevant to SMEs. And similarly, we have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS for short, and these also ask organisations to assess their value chain. And so I think the bottom line here is that the main standard setters for public disclosures that large companies are being required to use around the world all really are asking information about the value chain of their suppliers as part of this disclosure and assessment. So you are likely, if you haven't already, going to see larger companies that you supply or who you do business with looking to you for information to meet these disclosure requirements. And further to those standards that relate to public disclosure, on the right-hand side, we see a summary of a number of different organizations or platforms that are also looking to evaluate supply chain partners on their sustainability performance and data availability. For example, of course, we've got the Ethical Supply Chain Program who've joined us for today's workshop, and we'll hear a bit more from that about that from Tim later. But we also have a number of other initiatives as well. So we've got SEDEX and EcoVadis who provide services to look at enhancing transparency around sustainability with a focus on supply chains. And then also CDP, which is formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, but doesn't just look at carbon anymore, which is a corporate questionnaire used by more than 22,000 companies and 1,000 cities, states, and regions. And they particularly have a supply chain questionnaire as well, which large organizations can send to their suppliers, asking them to provide data as well on their emissions and other environmental issues. Okay, so keeping in mind what we've already heard so far, let's have a quick quiz question for you now, which you'll see just popping up there. So the question here is, what is your objective in joining this workshop or in integrating sustainability related considerations into your business objectives and decision-making practices? So maybe you already knew this, but maybe having just joined us and heard a few of those different drivers we've talked about, there might be something that's particularly coming up for you there that you think will be particularly relevant as a driver for your organization. Now you know a little bit more about this. So I'll give everyone a few more seconds to respond. We do keep the polls quite quick so that we can get through all our content today. I'd like to get at least half of us taking part in the poll, which I can see we've just passed. So thanks everyone for voting. Let's have a look at your answers here. So by far and away, it looks like the most popular response here was around building internal capacity to manage those risks and opportunities. But a number of you also indicating that achieving certifications, improving your ratings, in particular, might be the most relevant, with a few of you mentioning investors and sustainability reporting. So that's really great to see, and actually great to see that really that focus on building your internal capacities is coming through here, because of course, without that aspect of the process, you're going to miss a real opportunity, and your efforts might risk just being symbolic or damaging trust with clients if you just do reporting and don't take action internally. So fantastic to see so many of you already have that emphasis there on building your own internal capacity. And I think the best starting place really, and then some of those other objectives may come about in time. Great, thanks everyone. So I'll pass over to Tiffy now for our next section.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So now that we've discussed the big picture changes that are happening, I think it's important to acknowledge that smaller companies in particular face specific challenges in responding to these broader shifts that are taking place. So as you can see on this slide, SMEs in particular will face certain challenges that are related to their size and available resources. But there are also important opportunities that SMEs can capitalize on that can help overcome these challenges. And that's exactly why the guidance that we're sharing with you today focuses on practical, proportionate steps. So, what do I mean by proportionate steps? Well, proportionality means that what you do should be appropriate for your size, for your resources, and your level of impact. So you're not expected to do everything at once. The goal is to take manageable steps using what you already have. So in practice, proportionality can take on different approaches, which can sometimes lead to a bit of confusion since there's no one size fits all approach. That's because each company should be doing what makes the most sense for their specific circumstances. A few common practices for applying proportionality are listed on this slide. So, for example, you could stagger implementation, starting small and building over time. So, business might begin, for example, with if it's working on emissions, maybe start with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions today and work towards scope 3 as capacity grows. Or also, they might want to approach sustainability flexibly. So, exercising judgment to determine where taking action is most important and adjusting the approach as you learn over time. Now, with all of these approaches, the common thread is that action is taken, but it's tailored to fit your business, not the other way around. So to make this a little bit less abstract, I think let's go through a couple examples. Let's see what this might look like in practice. Now, throughout this workshop, we're going to be using two fictitious companies to bring these concepts to life. These two companies face the exact same world, the same pressures, the same opportunities, but they're different enough that their responses to these pressures and their decisions related to sustainability might look quite different, and justifiably so. So first, we have the company that we've called Green Stitch Garments. This is a fictitious company. They have 80 employees. It's family owned. It has one factory and three delivery vans. They make uniforms for local businesses, and recently they've started also to supply via the public sector procurement bidding system. Nobody on their team has sustainability in their job title, and they have never previously reported to anyone on their sustainability. And the second fictitious company we'll use today is one we've called Logiflow Solutions. This company has 250 employees and it's privately held with investors involved in their business. They manage freight across three different countries with a fleet of 40 vehicles. They're already subject to some sustainability reporting requirements in one of the countries that they work in. And their operations manager has recently taken on sustainability as part of their role. Now, let's suppose that both of these companies have just been asked by a client to provide emissions data. Let's look at how each one could respond to that request in a proportionate manner. So, using that principle of proportionality. So, I think to get started, let's review what are emissions. So there's three categories, three sources of emissions. As you can see in this diagram, they're referred to as scopes. So think of your company sitting in the middle and emission sources radiating outward on both directions. Scope one is what you directly control. The fuel combusted in Green Stitch's three delivery vans, for example, or Logiflow's fleet of 40 vehicles. Those emissions happen because of the assets those companies own and operate themselves. So they directly control those emissions. If they were to stop operating, those emissions would also stop. Then we have scope two, which moves one step out. It's the energy you purchase, mainly electricity, and the power running, for example, Green Stitch's production facility, which comes from the grid. And generating that electricity produced emissions, even if it's not on their premises. Then there's scope three, which is everything further out. So both upstream, meaning your supply chain, and downstream, meaning what happens after you've delivered. So for Green Stitch, that could be the fabric sourced from textile suppliers. For Logiflow, it might include the eventual disposal of goods their vehicles transported. Now, the diagram shows this full spectrum. The reporting company sits at the center with upstream activities flowing in from the left and downstream flowing out to the right. So with that in mind, now let's look at those two companies and see how they might respond to a demand for information on their emissions. So first, let's look at Green Stitch Garments, whose client asked them for the emissions associated with the uniforms they supplied as part of a procurement survey. So maybe take a moment now to think. Type in the chat some ideas of how you think they could get started. I'll wait till at least we have one brave participant who might suggest how you might get started. Check their energy bills. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I guess you had the slide to start with, but good job, Aston. So this is how we suggest that this company might have got started. They can get started first with data they already have. So electricity bills or fuel logs, that's a great first step. So with that, they can already start calculating their scope one and their scope two emissions. Now remember that fuel logs can help them calculate their scope one emissions, which includes the burning of fuel in their owned delivery vans. And for the electricity bills, this can help them to determine the emissions associated with powering their own buildings, which is scope two. So to calculate those emissions from the fuel logs and electricity bills, Green Stitch Garments may want to use a free tool to start. So for example, here we say that they use a free government calculator that helps to calculate estimated emissions using the data they already have. Also, a quick Google search can find a number of free calculators available to do that estimation. But when reviewing their emissions profile, Greenstitch also made an estimation of where their largest proportion of their emissions would be categorized. And this helped them determine that scope 3 was actually the most relevant category of emissions if they were assessed or if they were assessed for their own exposure or risk related to emissions and climate. For Greenstitch, the greatest source of emissions was estimated to be the raw materials such as cotton and synthetic fabrics that they buy in order to make their garments. So, because of this, they asked their main supplier that supplies 90% of their fabrics if they could share the emissions associated with the fabrics they're purchasing. And the supplier said they did not have that information. So, given their current expertise and resources, they determined it would not be feasible to determine even an estimation of scope 3 in the timeline they had to respond to that client questionnaire. So what they did was they decided to explain this in their summary report alongside their scope 1 and 2 emissions for their client. But they also explained that they're planning to assess whether they can work with their main supplier to calculate these emissions or even find another supplier because they recognize that this is some information that they too need to understand. So based on this information, Green Stitch Garments now has identified a possible risk that this particular supplier poses to them. If more clients ask for this information and they cannot get this from their main supplier supplying 90% of their materials, they risk losing contracts. So they start discussing this from a risk perspective and put into place some plans to be able to mitigate this risk. Now let's look at Logiflow Solutions. So they responded to a client procurement survey as well. And in their case, a client was asking for the emissions associated with the transportation of products. This makes sense. If you're a freight company, your client wants to know how much carbon is embedded in the logistics you're providing to them. So same type of ask as Green Stitch received, but a different company here. And so a different approach. So Logiflow Solutions has a lot more complexity here. They have 250 employees. They have a fleet of 40 vehicles operating across 3 countries. And they do actually have an operations manager who already has sustainability in their remit. So their starting point is a step further along. They began with scope 2, pulling their electricity bills. Quick to do. So it was a sort of starting point with an easy win. They then screened their scope 3 sources, which include staff travel, office purchases, waste, and made a considered judgment. These were not material enough to measure fully at this stage. That's proportionality in action. So in our first example, scope 3 was the focus because it was actually the most relevant for the company from a risk perspective. But this is a different company, and scope 3 is actually less relevant in terms of the big picture for this company, even though the company has more expertise and resources. Where they invested real effort was actually scope 1, their vehicle fleet. Something important to remember is that a fleet of 40 vehicles is really 4 identical vehicles. They have different ages, different makes, different fuel types, and each with a different emissions profile. So rather than applying a single average emissions factor across the whole fleet, like our other company must have done, Logiflow Solutions sourced specific factors per vehicle type and actually looked at the fuel efficiency data for each vehicle individually. What they found was that some vehicles were consuming significantly more fuel and therefore emitting far more than other vehicles. When they cross-referenced this with running costs, those same high-emitting vehicles were also the most expensive to operate. So what started as an emissions exercise very quickly became a cost savings conversation. They could now point to specific vehicles in the fleet that were dragging up both their carbon footprint and their operating costs and made a case for replacing them. So their output was a 2-page structured disclosure published online with a brief narrative on climate-related costs and a plan for reducing their fleet emissions over the next 5 years. If you compare that to Green Stitch, both responded proportionately to their own size and complexity. And for both, this was just the start. The first disclosure is rarely perfect, but it creates the baseline. And as Logiflow just demonstrated, sometimes the process of measuring your emissions surfaces business insights that you wouldn't have found any other way. So that's proportionality. It's not a lower bar. It's just the right approach for where each business is today. Now, with that, I'm going to wrap up our first module with a quick summary. So, remember that preparing for sustainability means three key things. First, understand the big picture. What's changing globally, locally in your industry? Understand your business context, what matters specifically for you, and understand your capacity to respond. What is realistic? These steps help you build a foundation before moving into strategy and action. And most importantly, this is about getting started in a way that works for your business. Now, with that, I'm going to pass back to Fiona, and she's going to start us off with our next module. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Tiffany. Great. So moving on now, we're going to get started on our second module, Align. So really in Prepare, we were thinking about what sustainability was, why to act on this, and that proportional approach that Tiffany just took us through there and how that can look quite different. Here in Align, we're going to be thinking about setting your organization up for success by integrating sustainability into your strategy and governance. So, in other words, really making sustainability a part of how your business is run. And it was great to see, obviously, in our last quiz question, so many of you already had that driver as one of the reasons for being here with us today. So, in this section, we'll focus on two key areas. So, firstly, objectives. So, thinking about how sustainability should fit into your strategy. And then we'll move on to oversight. So, thinking about how decisions are governed and monitored in your organization and how to include sustainability within those. So we'll kick off this section with another quiz question for you. So the question here is, should your company's strategy consider the future impacts of drought and drying up of water supply? So yeah, maybe this is a topic you're already working on, maybe it's a new one, but thinking about that issue of water supply in your region, or maybe the regions that you're sourcing from, do you think this is something that should be considered in your organization's strategy overall? So I'll give you all a few more seconds to respond. We're almost up to half of our participants taking part, so do let us know what you think. Always good to get the read of everyone here. No right or wrong answers, really, just a sense of what you're thinking. So let's end the poll and we'll share the results. So it looks like 85% of you went for yes, you think that your strategy should consider this. No one said no, and a few people said that they think it depends. Well, I think this is perhaps a little bit of a trick question because for some of you, the answer certainly could be yes. So, for example, if you were answering on behalf of Green Stitch Garments, who we just heard about, let's say that they're making their uniforms predominantly from cotton fabric. And so cotton, as you probably know, is one of the most water-intensive crops in the world. It takes roughly 10,000 liters of water to produce just 1 kilogram of cotton. So if the regions where their fabric suppliers grow and process that cotton started to experience serious drought or water scarcity, and of course, climate projections suggest that many regions will see that. Green Stitch could face supply chain disruptions, price spikes, or maybe even find that their main suppliers of cotton simply couldn't operate. And so for them, of course, water risk would be a very real strategic issue. So even if they were never to touch a drop of water themselves in their own factory, that's definitely something they'd want to consider. However, if we think about Logiflow Solutions, they run a freight business that operates on land. So their direct exposure to water scarcity is likely to be much lower. Drought usually doesn't stop a truck. So for Logiflow, this particular risk would potentially sit a fair bit further down their priority list. And so what's important to remember is that changes in water availability, like drought, aren't just environmental issues. They're real business risks, and they can, of course, be business opportunities as well if they're managed correctly. And so if your company operates in a region with reliable water access, whilst others may struggle in the future in regions with drought, it could be that your location could have a competitive advantage here. And so to help you start asking the right questions, we include a slide in the handout with some starting questions to integrate sustainability into your strategy. But in the interest of time, I'll move directly into our next activity, where we're going to really be starting to practice integrating sustainability into our strategy. So here we're going to focus on our two fictitious companies again and start to think about what it really means to integrate sustainability into our strategy. So the diagram we see here shows a simple, practical cycle for integrating sustainability. So you'll start by reviewing your vision and mission. We'll then scan the external landscape for risks and opportunities, focusing on what's most relevant for your business, as we just heard from that quiz question there. And then we'll thread that into your strategy and plans. So, really, this is a continuous cycle. The landscape keeps changing, and so should your response. So, let's walk through how that could work for Green Stitch. So, Green Stitch's vision is to become the leading supplier of high quality uniforms in the region. So, their mission is to be a reliable, responsible, and quality partner that makes their region's professional industries look and feel great in the workplace. So, notice that the word responsible is already sitting right there in their mission. And that's not a separate sustainability strategy, but really a foundation for them. So, responsible sourcing, responsible production, responsible client relationships. Sustainability can really grow quite naturally there from what Green Stitch are already saying that they stand for. And we also need to keep in mind here that they would want to be seen as a quality partner and reliable. Things to keep in mind as we look at the risks and opportunities and decide how they fit within their strategy. So this is a good starting point, but of course they might want to adjust it once they complete the other steps. So let's keep going and look at those. So now we move into step two, or scanning the external landscape. So to do that, there are a number of free resources and tools that can help you start. So there are three of those listed on the screen here. So firstly, Green Stitch could use the SASB Standards Materiality Finder. And this covers 77 different industries, and it identifies the particular sustainability related risks and opportunities which are likely to affect financial performance for that industry. So Green Stitch here might want to also consider what impacts their operations could have externally and the impact that they have on environment and society. And to help them do this, they could make use of the GRI sector standards. But unfortunately, the textiles and apparel standard there isn't fully complete yet. But you can keep that on the radar for future assessments, perhaps in that sector. And then finally, they could also make use of the voluntary SME guidance from EFRAG relating to the European reporting standards. This would support them to dive a little bit deeper into their assessment and help them to review key sustainability related topics. So this VSME standard isn't broken down by sector, but it does provide an extensive list of potential sustainability issues that could be discussed internally and determined whether they were relevant or not. So as I mentioned, that GRI sector standard wasn't available yet. So let's say that Green Stitch went straight to the SASB Materiality Finder, which you can see shown on the slide here. For those of you who don't know, SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and it's now actually a part of the IFRS Foundation, who set those IFRS S1 and S2 standards that we heard about earlier. The SASB standards are industry specific. So for each industry that is covered, there are identified a number of financially relevant issues for each sector that they'd likely want to consider. So in SASB, we have the apparel, accessories, and footwear sector, which we see on the screen here. And here it's identified that in particular, product quality and safety, supply chain management, materials sourcing, and efficiency are all areas that are going to be particularly relevant. So as well as these, Green Stitch had already identified greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly Scope 3 has been relevant for them due to the client procurement survey that they were asked to fill in. And as well, physical impacts of climate change also impacting their main factory, since it's located in an area that's increasingly affected by hurricanes and flooding. So to understand this a bit more, Green Stitch garments, they open up the standards for their particular industry to look at those more closely. And here we're seeing a summary of what's in that standard. So the SASB standard for their industry will give them a bit more detail on each topic. So if we take supply chain management, the standard flags that labour conditions are a relevant issue here, which for Green Stitch will mean thinking about whether the farmers that are supplying their cotton are operating to acceptable labour standards. And that's a conversation they now know that they're going to need to have with their suppliers as a result of this. So, using the SASB standards as a starting point and making use of their own understanding of how their business operates, Greenstitch will then put together a list of the main risks and opportunities that they saw. And so that included things like chemicals and water use regulation, given that they know that water is very important for cotton production already, and also that certain chemicals are going to be needed in the process of dyeing fabrics. And they also realised that child and forced labour is important by looking at the SASB standard, which identified that as well. And so while discussing the risks, they identified some opportunities as well on the flip side, such as being able to qualify for green or responsible procurement programs, or perhaps also saving costs through the efficient use of materials. And so this list gives them a good sense of where they should keep a watch on. But as a small company, it isn't necessarily possible that they address on or act on all of these items, of course. So the next step here will really be to determine where they can and should focus their resources and attention. So that brings us into the third step of the strategy integration. So this is where the landscape scan becomes a decision-making tool. So you might be familiar with a matrix like this, but this is a tool that can be useful for companies to identify where that they should focus on. And so Green Stitch has a go at evaluating each risk and opportunity that it's identified to help it determine uh, the likelihood, how the likelihood of what could happen, and if it did happen, would be relevant, and then also what the significance of the impact would be for its business. And so the items that really come out in the top right of the matrix here, which have a high likelihood of occurring and a high significance to operations, are really where we think that Green Stitch should focus first. So this means then that their focus should be on mitigating those risks relating to supply chain emissions, as well as child or forced labour. And in doing so, they should also look at those opportunities relating to product certifications and a level of standard that allows for being a viable candidate for green procurement programs. So items like regulation and hurricane damage, you'll see appear a little bit lower down the likelihood, but still quite high impact. So it's likely that these should be kept on the watch list and reviewed regularly so that the organization can continue to assess if it has the right resources and capabilities to manage those, and also if the potential likelihood or significance of these issues could change as well. So that brings us to the last step for Green Stitch, which is then integrating these issues into the strategy. So this is really where the work starts to become sort of more concrete. And for Green Stitch, focusing on those top right priorities leads to three strategic actions. So action one, making sustainable production the foundation of how Green Stitch competes. So this is all about committing to using sustainable materials, improving the efficiency of resource use, including energy and water. So this isn't a new strategy that sits alongside the business. It's really becoming a part of how Green Stitch defines that quality and responsibility, which we already saw was a part of their mission. And this includes for them looking into the use of solar panels for energy to both reduce their Scope 2 emissions, while also over the long term improving the cost efficiency of their production. This can also help them to apply for potential product certifications as well. A second strategic action that they identified was to integrate sustainability considerations into their own procurement policy. So that means making sustainability sourcing a standard, a part of how they buy, and not just because that's something the client asks for, but really as a baseline expectation of how they work with all of their own suppliers. Because there are two key risks that they want to mitigate through that. They will, of course, want to make sure that these policies address getting the emissions data they need for reporting purposes, as well as managing child and forced labour. And here in our handout, we have a slide about using policies to support decision making, which you can review in your own time if that's of interest to you as well. And then finally, the last strategic action we saw here is involving taking a closer look into the green procurement programs that are available and ensuring that the actions they're proposing to meet the requirements of these programs are there. So really then with all of these actions in place, Green Stitch will be able to start again to make sure that they still agree with their mission and vision, and that their long-term vision still holds now that they know about these particular challenges and they've set those strategic actions to manage them. Okay, so that's given us a little bit of a walkthrough of how that works for our first company, but we're not going to do all the work for you, and I'll pass over now to Tiffany, who'll help us all work through Logiflow's version of this together.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So hopefully that helps us understand how this process might look. But let's go through and do Logiflow together. And I'm just going to, again, share my screen and we're going to go back to that Mentimeter to work together. Great. Here we go. Okay, so you should be able to see now on the Mentimeter Logiflow Solutions and their vision and mission. You can also see on the screen the joining information. So I see we have 76 of you joined in the Menti already. Great, but it'd be great to get the rest of you in there too. So please join us while we go through the vision and mission. So Logiflow Solutions has a vision to become the go-to solution for getting products from point A to point B. Pretty simple vision there. Their mission is to be a reliable, an efficient, and a cost-effective partner that connects the whole supply chain. So this mission is built around efficiency and cost, which is completely understandable for a logistics business operating on tight margins across multiple markets. But there's the question that gets raised here on strategy is, as clients start asking about emissions and as investors want to understand risk management, and as regulations tighten in some of the markets that Logiflow operates in, does the mission they have built around efficiency and cost still position the business well for the future? So that's something that Logiflow might not be able to answer right now, but as they continue through this cycle and each review that they do, they might consider making slight adjustments either to their strategy to meet their mission and vision, or even changing their mission and their vision as they move forward. So this is exactly why reviewing your mission and vision matters. It's not to rewrite it overnight, but to ask honestly, does what we say we stand for still reflect where the world is going? So if you remember from Green Stitch Garments and Fiona's exercise with you, the second step was to scan the external landscape. And that is where they use tools like the SASB Materiality Finder, the GRI sector standards, or the VSME guidance to start to brainstorm what risks and opportunities might face a company. Let's together just do an initial brainstorm based on your own knowledge of transportation. And what are some risks and opportunities that immediately come to your mind? Now, as a reminder, Logiflow Solutions, the fictitious company, has 250 employees and a fleet of 40 vehicles across 3 countries. And we also were reminded at the start that it's already facing some regulatory requirements related to sustainability reporting in one of its markets. So I see a few of your responses are coming in now. Yeah, we see the first person said changes in energy prices, and another person fuel costs. Yeah, exactly. That's definitely a risk, especially when they're so focused on costs. Also, we see safety. Yeah, definitely in the transportation sector, they have drivers. Safety is certainly important to them. We see heightened amounts of gas emissions. Yes, and the requirements, especially since they've already been noted as having some reporting requirements in this area. Inefficiency and an expensive transportation fleet. Great. Vehicle breakdowns. Yeah, we need our vehicles to be working well and all the time. Accountability. We see a company has 250 employees, higher insurance costs, and driverless technology as an opportunity. Really great. What else? We have requirements for vehicles and the quality of those vehicles. Also an opportunity in modern technology in vehicles. Great. Transparency for sure. Illness. They have 250 employees for sure. That's also going to be an issue they have to consider. And regulations. Great. So I think you all have a number of really good options there of opportunities. Great. Oh, sorry. Well, I don't think we need voting there. I'm going to move us now to the next question. So, even just using our own knowledge of the sector, we actually came up with many risks and opportunities. But remember that this is still a very small company, and there certainly is not sufficient resources to address all of those risks and opportunities that you all mentioned. So, next, we need to determine where should they focus. So we've listed here just two risks and opportunities for Logiflow. The risks and opportunities that we added to the slide are based on the first two material issues of the SASB materiality finder for this particular industry. So let's do this together and start thinking about how each of these risks and opportunities is high or low likelihood for Logiflow and high or low significance for their business. Now, obviously, they would do this about all their risks and opportunities, but let's just try a couple of them. So, first is fleet carbon emissions. Now, remember that we saw earlier today that Logiflow actually found that some of their vehicles had higher emissions and also higher costs. And we also know that clients are already asking for this information. So I would say that this looks to be quite likely, given that already they're being asked for this information. And it's significant as it's already showing to be quite high as well, since their impact has come down into their costs. And we've seen that those emissions have a high cost. So I definitely agree with those who've already started voting on number one and have put it really as a high significance and high likelihood there. Now, the second risk we see is air quality. So, according to the SASB materiality finder for road transportation, road freight has a more localized negative effect on air quality from emissions of sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter. And a heavy reliance on diesel fuel is of particular concern. But we also found out at the start of this workshop, if you might remember, that a lot of their or all of their vehicles use gas, not diesel. So this is actually a low likelihood or lesser significance, but not totally irrelevant. So I would agree with those of you who put it still in likelihood of feasibility. It's still high and significance is still high because they have gas, but it's not as high as it would be if they were using diesel in their fleet. Next, we have a couple of opportunities. So let's look at the first one being biofuels. So here, rather than likelihood, we're going to be looking at feasibility. I think biofuels is an interesting one as it could be a way that Logiflow could reduce fuel costs and emissions at the same time. But the fact that the fleet is all gas powered, that means that it can really only use bioethanol, which is an ethanol blended with petrol. So this would only have a small impact on their emissions and also on their fuel costs. And in some countries, that's actually already standard practice. So given the type of vehicles they have, that might not be as impactful. So really important to really look at your company in particular, not the whole transportation industry. And finally, we have fuel efficiency improvements, which is really quite broad, but that could be things like improving the fuel efficiency through technology of optimizing routes or through procurement guidelines of future vehicles for fuel efficiency, etc. So this seems like a pretty feasible option, and it also has the potential to have a high impact. So I would definitely agree with those of you who put number 1 and 4 kind of in the top right-hand corner there as being high likelihood or feasibility and high significance. But you're all right that those other ones have quite a bit of impact too, so they would stay pretty high level there. Great. So now we have this matrix that can help us focus our attention. So I think number 1 and 4 are those that I think we've shown to have the most value for focusing our attention. Now, what is it that Logiflow can do? Remember, Fiona went through a few actions that the company could take. So let's have a think about that. What are the strategic actions that Logiflow could take, given the fact that it's focusing now on fuel efficiency and also making sure that it's taking into consideration its fleet's carbon emissions. I'll give you a second to fill that in. The first one's coming in here is convert vehicles to more economic fuel. Great. Yeah. Review vehicle using highest volumes of fuel. Yeah, that's a really good one. Let's not replace our whole fleet necessarily, but look at which ones need the most effort. Implement a vehicle maintenance plan, review its logistics model. Great. Outsource transportation to a more efficient company. Oh, that's very much changing their model. But if their focus is really efficiency and cost, maybe that's a great strategy for them moving forward. It's really taking that thought to the next level of thinking in the future, which is really what we want you guys to be doing here. Improve route planning. Yeah, exactly. This can really help to improve their efficiency if they're making more efficient route planning, and increasingly technology can help us to do that. Electric vehicles, electrification of the fleet. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we can't turn our whole fleet to, especially such a small company, into all electric vehicles overnight. That would be a very costly decision. And I would say that would not be proportionate, but maybe that's the objective they're moving for. So maybe their policies that they put in place take into consideration electrification, and maybe they want to aim for a certain percentage of their fleet to be electric and then slowly move forward. And likely it would be a combination of these ideas and how they all work together. Maybe one other thing I will note here is also rethinking their mission. So remember that Logiflow's mission is built around efficiency and cost. So based on everything we've just mapped out, we want to really think, is that still the complete picture? So one of the most strategic actions they could take is a conversation about whether their mission needs to evolve. Not a rebrand, just an honest question about whether they still stand for these objectives, and whether that will still work in the future if they implement these certain actions. Great. So well done, everyone. I think now I'm going to stop sharing. And we're going to come back to the slide deck. Great. So with that, I'm just going to move us forward a little bit. Perfect. So now that we've integrated or gone through how to integrate sustainability into strategy for these two companies, we cannot close out this unit without discussing the governance of that strategy. So what I wanted to share with you quickly before we wrap up this unit is this diagram from ISO 37000. That's the international standard on governance of organizations. And what I want you to notice is that at the very center of this model sits one word: purpose. And this is what ISO refers to as the primary governance principle. And everything else, the strategy, oversight, accountability, value generation, radiates outward from that. It's purpose. So governance, in other words, is about making sure that business stays true to what it exists to do. What is its purpose? And there is then enabling principles such as stakeholder engagement and social responsibility and risk governance that make it possible to achieve that purpose or that principle. And on the very outside of the circle, we have the three governance outcomes. So responsible stewardship, effective performance, and ethical behavior. So why do we need governance? Now, good governance isn't just about compliance or oversight. It's actually one of the most practical tools that a business has for growing sustainably and for building trust. So this slide shows 4 ways that governance creates real business value. So for companies considering a future listing or access to public markets, governance is the gateway. Exchanges and regulators expect it, and building it early makes it an easier transition later on. So for investor due diligence, ESG oversight is increasingly a key criterion. Investors want to know that someone is watching the sustainability risks and not just managing the day-to-day. For credibility and partnerships, governance builds that trust needed. Clients, partners, and suppliers want to work with businesses that can demonstrate they make decisions responsibly and consistently. And for family businesses specifically, governance helps to manage the tensions that naturally arise around succession, around ownership, and around decision making. And having clear structures in place before those conversations become urgent is far better than the alternative. So, good governance, in other words, is an investment in the long-term health of a business. Now, what happens if there is no board, which we normally associate with governance? So, for many SMEs, particularly family owned or founder led businesses, the shareholder, the board, and the management are actually all the same person. And that creates some specific governance challenges worth naming openly. So, without a board, decisions rarely get systematically tested before being acted on. This increases the risk of biases and also of blind spots. And when you're also managing day-to-day operations, it's very hard to lift your head and think long term. So the urgent almost always beats the important. So trade-offs that in a larger business would be explicitly debated, such as dividends versus reinvestment or family needs versus business needs, they often get resolved quietly, often without anyone realizing a decision was even made. And risk management tends to be reactive, drawing on gut instinct rather than structured discussions. So, two final points I think that are worth flagging on this slide is that the key person dependency, so the business's continuity, should be tied not to one person's presence and judgment. This often comes when there's no succession plan, for example. And the reduced external credibility, so investors and lenders are increasingly aware of these dynamics, then may see the business as a higher risk without independent oversight. And that's not a criticism. It's just the reality for most owner managed businesses. So, if you'd like guidance on implementing effective governance without a formal board, we've included some practical slides in the handout. In particular, you can make use of the IFC's guide on SME governance. Thanks, Fiona, that's just been popped in the chat. And this guidance, which you can find a link now in the slide and in the chat, is a free practical resource that's been developed specifically for smaller businesses, recognizing that most corporate governance is written for large companies. But SMEs need to get started on this too to prevent that last point on key person dependency and the other points on the slide. So let's wrap up now with a quick summary of this session or this this module. So as a reminder, for aligning sustainability, this means you need to integrate it into your strategy through objectives, and you need to ensure that you have the right structure and oversight in place, and that creates the clear foundation for effective implementation. Now, I recognize that you've all been here now for over 1 hour, so it's time for a quick break. So if you please take just 5 minutes, when the music ends and this timer comes to a stop, we'll resume our training. Hope you have a good short break. Okay, I hope that music woke you all up. I was doing a little jig in my seat, so hopefully you all enjoyed that. Let's dive straight back in now. And this is our third module, which is on implement. And this is where we move from strategy and understanding what to focus on into practice in those areas we want to focus on. So before we dive into the presentation today, I just want to flag that in our guidance, there are four key steps for the implementation stage. That's identifying the most important issues through risk management practices, really building on what we just did in the last section. Then developing a plan, identifying who is responsible, and then implementing those actions. Again, this is not about doing everything. It's about focusing on what matters most for your business and then taking action. So I'm very pleased to invite now our guest from Ethical Supply Chain Program, Tim, to share with us what this looks like in practice. Tim, thanks so much for being with us today. I think you should have slide control, and I'll pass over to you now for your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Fiona. And hello, everyone. I am more than delighted to join today's training session. It's great to also know that there's a good level of knowledge now on these topics amongst the participants. So let me start by quickly introducing myself again. My name is Tim Ziegler, and I manage the Social Impact Assessment Program here at the Ethical Supply Chain Program. It's always quite a mouthful, or ESCP. ESCP is a not-for-profit organization that has been operating for more than 20 years on a global scale. We work with companies of all sizes, but a large percentage of them are SMEs. We help them to understand, to manage and improve their sustainability performance across various operations and supply chains. And over the next 10 minutes, my goal is a simple one. I hope to demystify what sustainability means in practice, to show that many of you or the companies that you're engaging with are already on this journey and possibly performing a lot better than you think. And most importantly, I want to share practical and achievable steps that SMEs can take right away to start to make progress on the sustainability journey. Right, as others have said today, companies are increasingly expected to understand and manage ESG risks across the supply chain. It's not just a nice to have anymore, it's becoming a customer expectation, a regulatory requirement, and a business resilience issue. But here's the key point. Most SMEs already have pieces of this strategy and that's in place. In fact, 82% of the companies we assess are SMEs. So our knowledge of SMEs and sustainability is well developed. Therefore, this session is not about starting from zero. It's about sharing how companies can build on what they already do. A structured approach to developing a robust sustainability strategy delivers measurable benefits, if not only mitigates downside risk, but identifies upside opportunities and thus positively impacts the financial performance of companies. Right, on this slide, I wanted to highlight that when we work with SMEs, we consistently see strong sustainability foundations already in place. Our main strength includes management oversight. As we have heard, most SME founders are still very much part of the day-to-day operations of companies. So there's good internal, to make sure there's good internal communication. Smaller teams often have easier, more frequent communication, and health and safety is a priority, which is often driven by legal compliance and consequence. However, common gaps do exist. And for example, they include a lack of formal risk assessment processes, which we believe are critical when considering your sustainability strategy and materiality, A lack of structured supplier management is another. We know that beyond tier one, suppliers are higher risk. So it's important that you know and understand your supply chain. More serious labor standards and environmental risks occur further down the supply chain. A lack of monitoring and training systems. These systems, when in place, provide further insights which enable you to enhance and adapt your sustainability strategy, which in turn helps increase its relevance and its positive impact. So the opportunity for many is to move from informal practices to structured systems. So structured systems help support consistent performance and predictable outcomes. We simplify sustainability into 5 practical steps that any SME can start with. And remember, you don't need to do everything at once. Think of these steps more like building blocks, which each one strengthening your system and your confidence. I believe there's a handout which you can download from the chat. So step 1, you define the scope and priorities. Key to this is to balance impact, risk, and practicality. Step 2 is identify the key risks and stakeholders. So here, think about what and where are your biggest risks, which operations or suppliers matter most, and who are the key stakeholders and what are their needs. Start simple by mapping risks. It's a very powerful exercise. It helps achieve focus and gain alignment within a company. For step 3, you collect and assess the data. So this does not need to be overcomplicated. You can start with what you have and think about the gaps that exist and how to address them. Data from procurement colleagues, for example, will help you map your supply chain. Industry level data that may be available from trade associations, global risk indices from organizations like the UN, the ILO, etc. All of these are available to you and help you to start to inform and develop your strategy. Now for step 4, you put in place the policies. You document and communicate these policies, which is a very critical point. Some key policies might include a supplier code of conduct, your health and safety rules and standards, and your requirements around labor standards. But make sure you keep them simple, you keep them clear and relevant. And here I want to stress again that relevance is really important, and it comes back to defining your scope and your priorities. And lastly, for step 5, you monitor and assess. So use the structured questions to evaluate your systems. For example, within ESCP, most SMEs score around 60 out of 100, meaning they already have a solid base to build from. Sustainability is a continuous cycle. A robust oversight program will then help you identify the gaps that you have, so you can take the action and track the progress. And importantly, it is good to celebrate the successes along the way. On my next slide, I wanted to share an example of how performance can be measured and improved. These assessments can be internally created within your own business or managed by a third party like ESCP. They help a company understand where they are, their strengths and their weaknesses, and inform the path forward. So something very simple to keep in mind is to write down what you already do. So think about how do you manage it, and this helps you then move forward. For example, this automatically moves you from being a reactive level company by writing things down to the more developed or developing standard, indicating that you have well-defined and implemented sustainability strategies. I keep reminding you of this data point to highlight that a company's performance is often stronger than you think. There's also loads of free to access materials available to companies which can help you improve along the way. Now, a quick case study example for the next slide I just wanted to share with you, which helps highlight how ESP Color started gaining some benefits by joining our assessment, whether it's delivered by a third party or created from your own materials. ESP Color is a company that participated in the social impact assessment program. It was required by their customer. So the customer have now different reasons for requiring a company to undergo an external assessment, but it's mainly to provide insights, in this case, to their sustainability strategy and their performance. One example would be to help prevent and mitigate human rights, environmental risks in their supply chain as part of their own values, as well as regulatory requirements. And for the assessment process, which ESP went through, they delivered a few things. They updated their policies, they updated their staff handbook, which in turn enabled consistency and predictable outcomes from their policies. They introduced a new health and safety monitoring system, which is very important in this sector to help mitigate long-term financial and legal liability risks from, let's say, workplace illnesses, for example. In addition, they strengthened their monitoring and insights reporting approach to help inform their strategy in the future. And what they did is they turned existing practices into structured systems. The outcome was that they could evidence their ethical and sustainable credentials with confidence. And this is really important to avoid allegations or indeed sanctions from misleading ESG claims and statements. Right. On my next slide, I wanted to quickly highlight how an assessment process works in practice. So typically we see four main phases. So setup or registration, the evaluation, actioning suggested items, and going through the reassessment. And there's some detail on this slide which you can access after the presentation or go through in a bit more detail in your own time. To think about how each step works. Typically, the assessments are repeated on a regular process, something like every 12 months. And importantly, the assessment is shared in the form of a report tailored specifically to you as an SME, and you can then share that with any customers or regulatory bodies as a way to evidence and communicate what you're doing around sustainability. When we look at ESP, again, for example, our assessments are remote, which means it was scalable. It could be done from anywhere. They're also low cost and globally available, as I just mentioned. There's also the benefit that they're independently verified, and further support is also provided to address any flagged improvements. Right, some final comments. I just wanted to share some contact information. So you will see the email to the CEO of ESCP, and I'd like to leave you as well with three key messages. Companies are probably further ahead than they fear. So be confident around your performance, focus on progress, not perfection, and remember small steps create momentum. Thank you for your time, and please do get in touch if you wish to discuss or learn any further, or you can leave any questions in the Q&A. Thank you, and I'll bring it back to Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Tim. And it looks like Jesse's already going to be in contact with you, Tim. So great. Thank you for sharing what that looks like in real practice. Now, as a reminder, this is all from real life experience. So Tim and his team at ESCP have been working with SMEs and other larger companies as well on, improving their sustainability, specifically within supply chain. So you can look at their website too for a number of other case studies they have and examples and resources. So thanks so much for being with us today, Tim. Now, after that really good overview of how to get started, I just want to remind you of what the SSE model guidance suggests in implementation. Now, that's identifying your most important issues, developing a plan for managing these issues, assigning responsibility, and thinking about the people in your organization and taking action. And of course, you can use all the work that Tim shared to really build that out and identify your steps. Now that takes us to the very last module of this training. So well done, everyone, making it this far. And I'm going to pass to Fiona, who's going to take us through that last module. Over to you, Fiona.
Great. Thanks again, Tiffany. So, yes, we're moving into our last module now, communicate. So, really, here, this is all around how we share our sustainability information with different stakeholders, which again is another aspect we know is increasingly becoming important and feeds into a lot of what we've talked about already. So, we're going to talk about two key things here. So, we'll start with progression. So, that's thinking about how you can measure and report your progress over time. And then we'll move into what we're calling the data mix. So, thinking about how you might combine both qualitative and quantitative information in your approach. And I hope that what we'll learn from this section as well will echo what I think was a nice endpoint from Tim there in his segment, that you probably already have a lot more here that you can work with than you might think. So, let's take a look at this. So, in terms of sustainability communication, there's a few different forms that this could take. And here we've just shown a few examples of what it could look like. So, this might mean internal reporting, both to your own management and to your shareholders, maybe to your employees as well. It could also include kind of the on-demand or reactive provision of information in response to particular requests. So perhaps those requests from your customers or to respond to particular reporting initiatives, as we heard about a little bit earlier in the training. Or finally, you can also think about external public communication to your stakeholders. So perhaps your more proactive communications that you put out through different channels, including your website, maybe sustainability reports, etc. For SMEs and those getting started on this, the aim is, of course, not to make this too complex or costly, but really the approach should be around thinking how you can make key information accessible and consistent, rather than necessarily producing some large sustainability report that, let's be honest, probably is going to end up sitting on a shelf and gathering dust. So, coming back then, let's remind ourselves briefly of why we would look to communicate this information. So, I think we'd say that sharing sustainability information has a number of key benefits. So, firstly, it's going to give the recipient of that information a better understanding of the risks and opportunities the business faces. And of course, really, the process of preparing that communication is likely to help you as a business understand those issues better yourself. It can also help you to enhance your reputation. So, helping to demonstrate to your clients and your stakeholders how you're managing not just risks, but also your wider impact on environment and society as well. In a related way, it can also help you to strengthen your relationships with your customers and partners. So, providing with that the information that they need, and also really helping to ensure you're meeting their expectations of you regarding sustainability. And finally, as well, of course, that communication can help you to align your own operations and strategy. So, as we said, just the process of preparing, statements for other stakeholders is often a really helpful thought process to go through, because communication isn't just about compliance. It's really that tool that can help you to make better decisions and build stronger relationships. So, what should you be disclosing and to who? The key principle I think that we would say here is that you need to share enough strategic detail that's going to inspire confidence and ensure alignment, whilst providing that balance where you protect any information that could perhaps be seen as compromising to your competitive position. And so this is also where the level of detail is going to need to be tailored to the audience and to the communication channel. So what you put on your website, of course, is not going to be the same as what you might send to a client directly. And what you share with an investor isn't necessarily what you might share with a client or customer. But of course, we do want to make sure we're overall aligned in what we're saying, and that the message is broadly consistent, even if the type of information and the detail may be different. So we're going to revisit our two companies now to see how this could play out in practice. So we'll start with Green Stitch, and we'll think about their website. So we've heard already that they've decided to target high quality and sustainable garment markets as a growth area. And so their website is going to become an important first signal to potential clients that their practices really match that promise. So they've set a vision statement, but really, how does that manifest in practice in the way they operate? So, in order to demonstrate this, they will publish on their website their sourcing and environmental policies. They will also perhaps put information about any particular external certifications or labels that they've achieved, which demonstrate, the standard and quality that they've reached in terms of ethics and sustainability. And then also, they've articulated that mission and vision, and I think they'll put that statement onto their website and provide a bit of an explanation alongside that about how they're planning to achieve that and what the steps are they're taking. So hopefully you'll see here, this isn't suggested to be anything too complex, but really just enough information for a client who's doing due diligence here to feel confident that they're dealing with a responsible supplier, and that rhetoric is really matched up by the right policies, practices, and actions. So let's compare and see what Logiflow might want to do with their website, perhaps telling a slightly different story to a different audience. So we know that their clients care in particular about cost, stability, and reliability. So the Logiflow focus here is going to be on demonstrating that they're prepared for that future. So specifically the issues around fuel regulation and the transition to more sustainable fuel sources. So, to evidence this, they published their fleet management strategy on their website. They also provide transparency over their greenhouse gas emissions report, and again, any kind of green logistics certifications that they may have obtained. So, the message really that they're looking to convey here is that they're on top of these issues. And as a client, you're not going to be hit with an unexpected cost increase because these are issues that they're not actively managing. So again, the same channel, their website, but quite a different focus because the audience and the strategic positioning are different. And coming back to the issues that they've chosen to identify and integrate into their strategy, they've got slightly different priorities. So now let's look inwards. So what information they might want to share internally. Thinking about Green Stitch, they've recognised that their new sustainability focus could really be a genuine motivator for their workforce. People want to feel proud of where they work, and it might also help them to attract new staff as well. But there's really a practical need. Staff need to understand the new policies that they're putting in place and what changes that could mean in how they're going to do their jobs day to day so that they can really play their role in that. So their internal communications here will focus on training around their environmental practices. So thinking about perhaps health and safety briefings as well. And maybe they would also think about the channel they provide these communications. So maybe some staff are office-based and might receive this information via email, but actually a lot of the workers on the factory floor may need to see this information on notice boards, in team briefings, etc., as well to make sure it's reaching them. So really this again shouldn't be too arduous, we hope. It doesn't necessarily require a dedicated communications team, but it's just about keeping informed and engaged in a way that's proportionate to the size of the business. So, maybe this information could be integrated into existing meetings or bulletins that already go out. So then let's go again to Logiflow. So by contrast, they have investors and a board to report to. So in that carbon emissions assessment that they undertook of their fleet, they did surface some particular risks and opportunities that need to be discussed at that board level and not necessarily just filed away in a report. And so they prepare a board presentation to brief their leadership team on this. covering four key things. So they highlight the client demand for emissions data and where that's heading. So the growing number of their clients asking for this information, and maybe some of those external initiatives as well that are likely to see more demand in the future. For example, the European reporting requirements. They also highlight some of the incoming regulatory expectations in their market. These could include emissions specific regulations, maybe for the actual vehicles, but also maybe there's going to be new reporting requirements as well. And then they also have fuel cost uncertainties and the options to consider around the electrification and switch to biofuels in their fleets. So, they've already identified some of the volatility there that could be better managed through having a clear strategy. And finally, they're considering as well green certification and green financing options. So, this could include both certifications that help to evidence their approach to suppliers, maybe ones that qualify them for public procurement contracts or new types of financing as well. And so this demonstrates really how the sustainability information that they've gathered through their assessments is being used exactly as it should be to inform strategic decisions at that highest level of the business. So now when we talk about public disclosures specifically, whether that's a report or website or a structured disclosure, there's an important concept worth understanding here, and that's materiality. So there are two lenses that you can apply here. The first is financial materiality. So this asks what sustainability issues could affect the company itself. So possible risks to revenue, costs, reputation, access to finance. And this is the lens that's used by the IFRS and the SASB standards. And it's the lens as well that investors are typically most interested in. The second is impact materiality. So this is thinking about the impact that the company itself has on the outside world. So on people, on communities, and on the environment. And this is the lens that we see used by the GRI. And then if we bring those two together, we have what we call double materiality. And this considers both of those lenses together. So this is the approach that's required by the European reporting requirements for large companies, and it's what those European reporting standards are built upon. So we know that this can feel like quite a lot, but it is important to understand both of those lenses to help you to have a more complete picture of perhaps why certain organizations are asking for certain types of information, how to structure your communications. So we just included this here as a primer, but it's something you might want to go away and take a little bit more of a look at. And lastly, this just brings us to a very practical resource for SMEs who want to start structuring their communications here, which is the EFRAG's Voluntary Sustainability Reporting Standard for SMEs, or the VSME guidance, as it's called. So this was developed by EFRAG, which is the standard setting body for European reporting. And it's really designed to take a proportionate approach for smaller businesses. So we talked about already that the SME standard covers the same topics as the standards that larger companies will be asked to use in Europe, but it's tailored specifically to SMEs in their size and capacity. So crucially, it's also supposed to help companies to respond in particular to the data requests that they're receiving from large companies themselves. So if your client or your partners are larger European companies, this standard may well be very helpful as a structure to work to in your communications to make sure you're giving the right information to those organizations. And there's also some additional guidance and tools here working on emissions reporting. So this is a free resource and it's a really practical approach. So even if you're not formally required to use it, we think it's something that we definitely recommend that you check out. So finally, you'll find a few extra tips that we include in the slides here on effective communications. So take a look at those in the handout. But let's move to the final part of our training, which I'll pass you back to Tiffany for.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. And yeah, we're in the last 8 minutes now. So I'm going to come back to the Mentimeter one last time. And we're going to do a quick activity together. So if you were asked, and some of you filled this in already, so thanks very much. If you were asked by a client, perhaps, to provide following information in the next 30 days, could you do it? Yes or no? Let's say, 0 is no and 1 is yes. Where do we land here? What about scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions? Are you prepared to be able to answer that in the next 30 days? What about dependence on natural ecosystem services? Um, do you know enough about nature? Have you done an assessment? Would you know where to start? And what about gender equality? What percentage of women are in each operating level of your organization? Now, the very first person who filled this in said no to all three of them, which, is a little startling sometimes, but hopefully, at least now, you realize that you have a lot of resources to get you started with, at least on the scope one, two, and three emissions, which we talked about at the start. But this training program can help you, and the resources in it can help you get started on all three of these. It looks like we've moved over to about 70% of you on average can start on one of these in the next, or it can provide this information in the next 30 days. But the question then is, what happens if you cannot provide this information? So if you're not able to overcome the barriers to providing this information, if you're not prepared in advance enough to be able to provide this information in 30 days, what do you think would be the result? I'm gonna wait for at least one person to share what they think would happen. Yes, exactly. The relationship might be affected. The first person there. Worst case scenario, you could lose that contract. You might not get larger business, mistrust in the organization, loss of a potential opportunity. Exactly. So really looking at this from a risk perspective is important and understanding who might be asking for information from you, where that, those needs might be coming from, and how can you prepare for those? Maybe it's not already having all that information available, but being prepared to be able to collect the information, for example, when the requests start coming in. Now, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you one more question, and that's coming back to the very first question I asked you today. Do you feel ready to integrate sustainability into your business practices? Now, when we started today, the average of the whole group was 6. So we did actually already have a few that were very comfortable, but then we had some that were very uncomfortable with this. And what we're hoping is that more and more of you feel comfortable with this topic now. And I'm very happy to see that actually we've already moved up quite a bit. The majority of you are already, above at least the 4.4 or 5 point there. And the average now is up to 7.8. So I'm glad that you're all feeling more comfortable. And I hope that as you review these resources, you can also come back and watch this video again. Then you'll become more and more comfortable. But as we keep discussing, yes, it's good to see that someone says in the chat, yes, I'm ready. So good. But as we said many times in this workshop, and as you'll see as you continue with these resources, it's not about perfection. It's about getting started. So take those first few steps, and then use the resources that we've shared. As in this reminder, it's not about having perfect data. It's about being ready and able to respond to evolving requirements and expectations. And these resources we share with you today will help you do that. So to wrap up this unit, just a reminder of the actions in the communication section. So make sure to measure and report on progress over time, and make sure to use a mix of both qualitative and quantitative data to tell your story. Now, with that, I'm glad to see that you found it to be a very effective informational session with key actionable takeaways, and I hope you make those actions. But with our last few minutes together, I want to just share some key resources that you should have on your desktop and ready to go moving forward. The first is the UNSSE checklist, which comes in our model guidance, and you can find that on our website and linked to in the chat. Thanks, Fiona. You can also access the IFC's sustainability assessment and improvement tool from our slides. This is designed specifically for mid-sized growth companies. And it's an Excel-based instrument with a user guide, and it helps you to systematically assess where your business currently stands on sustainability across all the key areas: strategy, governance, risk management, operations, and communication. And then it helps you identify priority actions and track your progress over time. So that link is also available in the chat and in our slides. And finally, the IFC's Beyond the Balance Sheet platform. This is a one-stop shop for sustainability and climate disclosure guidance, particularly designed for companies in emerging markets. It includes tools, e-learning resources, and self-assessments. If you want to go deeper on any of the topics we've covered today, particularly around disclosure reporting, this is an excellent next step for you. And again, it's in the chat and it's also in your slide deck. Now that brings us to the moment you've all been waiting for. Congratulations, everyone who stayed to the very end. And it's great to see that the majority of our participants stayed for the full webinar. So how do you get your certificate for your great participation today? Now, all you have to do is fill out a feedback survey and quiz. Fiona just shared that in the chat, but also you will get emailed that for all of those of you who participate and stayed in our webinar, you'll get an email from Zoom tomorrow with this link. So if you missed it in the chat, don't worry. You will get access to that via Zoom. Once you fill in the Google survey, you will get feedback or you will get your certificate within the next few days. So thank you for participating in this workshop, and we look forward to sending out your CPD certificate in the next few days. Now, before we close today, I want to send a big thank you to all of the SSE official supporters. These are stock exchanges and organizations that provide a financial contribution to the UN SSE, and they make all of the SSE Academies work possible and training like this free to all of you. So if you would like to join the supporters and show your commitment to sustainability, please reach out to us at info@sseinitiative.org. And for this particular training program, a big thank you to all of our partners. Now, that includes our guest speakers from Ethical Supply Chain Program. Thank you, Tim, for being with us today. It also includes the IFC and the Swiss government for making this training possible. And of course, our host today, the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange. Thank you so much to Joy and Natasha and their team for making this possible and bringing it to your market. It was a pleasure to be with you all today, and we wish you a very good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.